In the early years of the 20th century, before Detroit became shorthand for both industrial might and industrial collapse, there was one place that embodied pure ambition. A place that did not just build cars, but reshaped how the modern world would work, live, and think. This was not a factory hidden on the edge of town or tucked quietly along a river. This was a massive, smoking, roaring complex planted right in the city's bloodstream. The Ford Highland Park Plant was not simply a workplace, it was an experiment on humanity itself. At its peak, this factory promised efficiency, prosperity, and a better future. It delivered something far more complicated, because behind the innovation, behind the legendary moving assembly line, and behind the stories of $5 days and affordable cars, there was another reality, one shaped by control, exhaustion, fear, and a level of social engineering that still feels unsettling today. This is the dark story behind Detroit's most influential factory. To understand why Highland Park mattered so much, you have to go back to a time when cars were not everyday objects. In the early 1900s, automobiles were fragile, expensive machines built mostly by hand. They were toys for the wealthy. Mechanics assembled them slowly, often crafting individual parts as they went. Production was inconsistent, costs were high, and reliability was questionable. For most Americans, owning a car was unthinkable. That was the world Henry Ford wanted to destroy. Ford was not the first person to build a car, and he was not the first to imagine mass production. But he was obsessed with one radical idea. If a car could be built cheaply enough, ordinary working people could afford one. And if ordinary people could afford cars, society itself would change. Cities would sprawl, jobs would expand, distance would shrink. Ford did not just want to sell vehicles. He wanted to remake America in his own image. In 1909, Ford's company began work on a new factory in Highland Park, a city just north of Detroit. The location was strategic. It had access to rail lines, plenty of space, and a growing labor pool. But what made this plant different was not its location. It was its design. Unlike older factories that grew piece by piece, the Highland Park plant was planned from the ground up as a single, integrated production system. Construction began in 1909, and by 1910, the first sections were already operational. The architect, Albert Kahn, was one of the most important industrial designers of the era. He used reinforced concrete, massive windows, and open floor plans that flooded the factory with light. This was not just aesthetic. It allowed managers to see everything, every worker, every movement, every second. From the beginning, Highland Park was about control. At first, production still looked somewhat familiar. Teams of workers assembled cars at stationary positions. Parts were delivered to them, and skilled mechanics handled multiple steps of the process. But Ford and his engineers were constantly experimenting. They timed movements. They broke tasks down into smaller and smaller actions. They asked one ruthless question again and again. How can this be done faster? The answer came in 1913. That year, inside the Highland Park plant, Ford introduced the moving assembly line. Instead of workers moving to the car moved to the workers. Each man performed one simple task over and over as the chassis rolled past him. The impact was immediate and staggering. Assembly time for a single Model T dropped from more than 12 hours to about 90 minutes. Productivity exploded, costs collapsed, and the modern industrial world was born. The Model T became a symbol of freedom and progress. By 1915, Ford was producing more than half of all automobiles in the world. Highland Park became the beating heart of this operation. Tens of thousands of men poured into the plant each day. Immigrants from Eastern Europe, African Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South, farmers leaving failing land. They all came chasing the same promise: steady work, good pay, a chance at the American dream. But inside the factory, that dream came with a price. The assembly line was efficient, but it was brutal. Jobs were simplified to the point of absurdity. One man tightened the same bolt every few seconds for hours on end. Another attached the same wheel again and again. The work required little skill, but it demanded absolute endurance. There was no room for creativity, no room for slowing down. The line never waited. Workers were expected to keep pace with the machine. If they fell behind, the entire line suffered. Supervisors watched constantly. Time clocks ruled the day. Fatigue set in quickly. Injuries were common, and the mental toll was enormous. Men spoke of feeling like extensions of the machinery itself, reduced to living parts in a mechanical system. Turnover skyrocketed. In 1913 alone, Ford hired more than 50,000 men to maintain a workforce of just 14,000. Workers quit in droves, unable to handle the monotony and pressure. This threatened Ford's entire system. The assembly line was useless if no one stayed long enough to work it, so Ford made another move that would shock the world. In January 1914, the company announced it would pay workers $5 a day for an 8-hour shift. At a time when most industrial laborers earned around $2 for 10 or 12 hours of work, this was revolutionary. Newspapers called it madness. Competitors laughed. Economists warned it would bankrupt the company. It did the opposite. The $5 day transformed Highland Park overnight. Lines of men stretched around the block, desperate for a job. Turnover plummeted. Productivity increased even further. Ford workers could now afford the very cars they were building. It was a masterstroke of capitalism. But the raise was not unconditional. To earn the full $5, workers had to meet strict standards set by Ford's sociological department. This was not a metaphor. Ford employed investigators who visited workers' homes, interviewed their families, and scrutinized their private lives. They checked for cleanliness, sobriety, and moral behavior. Gambling, drinking, or living in what the company considered improper conditions could cost a man his bonus. Ford believed he was improving society. He saw himself as a moral reformer, lifting immigrants out of poverty and teaching them American values. English classes were mandatory. Cultural traditions were discouraged. Workers were expected to conform not just on the factory floor, but in their own homes. For many, this felt less like opportunity and more like surveillance. Highland Park was not just a place of work. It was a system of control that extended far beyond the gates. The factory shaped daily routines, family structures, and social behavior. It rewarded obedience and punished deviation. And while wages were high, the cost was personal freedom. Racial dynamics added another layer of complexity. Ford hired African American workers at a time when many factories refused to. This made Highland Park a magnet for black migrants from the South. For some, it offered rare economic stability, but discrimination remained deeply embedded. African American workers were often assigned the hardest, dirtiest jobs. Advancement was limited, and tensions between white and black workers were deliberately exploited by management to prevent unionization. Ford was fiercely anti-union. He believed organized labor threatened efficiency and control. At Highland Park, any hint of union activity was crushed. Spies monitored conversations. Known organizers were fired. Fear kept most workers silent, even as conditions wore them down. By the 1920s, the factory was running at full capacity. The Model T rolled off the line in staggering numbers. Detroit boomed. Neighborhoods expanded. Roads spread outward. America fell in love with the automobile, and Highland Park stood at the center of it all, a symbol of industrial triumph. But success carried the seeds of decline. The same rigidity that made Highland Park efficient also made it inflexible. As consumer tastes changed, the factory struggled to adapt. The Model T was famously unchanged for years. When competitors introduced new styles and features, Ford resisted. Inside Highland Park, the system was optimized for one thing and one thing only. Eventually, even Henry Ford had to admit defeat. In 1927, production of the Model T ended. The factory shut down temporarily to retool for the Model A. But the world was changing. Newer, larger plants were being built elsewhere. The massive River Rouge complex began to eclipse Highland Park in importance. Slowly, the factory that once defined the future became a relic of the past. During the Great Depression, production slowed, layoffs mounted. The certainty that Highland Park once promised evaporated. Workers who had built their lives around the factory found themselves adrift. The social contract that Ford had created began to unravel. By the mid-20th century, Highland Park was no longer the crown jewel of Ford's empire. Parts of the plant were repurposed, other sections fell silent, jobs moved out, automation increased. The surrounding city began to suffer. As Detroit's population declined, Highland Park followed. The factory that had once drawn tens of thousands now stood partially empty. By the 1970s and 1980s, large portions of the complex were abandoned. Windows shattered, roofs collapsed, weeds pushed through concrete floors. What had been a place of relentless motion became eerily still. The assembly lines were gone, but the weight of history remained. For urban explorers and historians, the ruins told a haunting story. This was where the modern world had been assembled, piece by piece, and now it was falling apart. The decline of the Ford Highland Park Plant mirrored the decline of Detroit itself. Deindustrialization, suburbanization, and global competition hollowed out the city's core. Jobs vanished, communities fractured. The promise of industrial prosperity faded into memory. Yet even in decay, the influence of Highland Park is everywhere. The moving assembly line it perfected became the foundation of global manufacturing. From electronics to food production, the principles developed here spread worldwide. The idea of standardized labor, timed efficiency, and relentless optimization reshaped economies and lives across the planet. So did the darker lessons. Highland Park showed what happens when human beings are treated as components in a machine. It revealed the psychological cost of repetitive labor. It demonstrated how economic power can extend into private life, and it exposed the fragile balance between prosperity and exploitation. Today, parts of the site are being redeveloped. Others remain abandoned. Concrete walls still stand, scarred by time. Sunlight pours through broken windows just as it did a century ago, though now it illuminates silence instead of motion. When you walk through what remains of the Ford Highland Park plant, it is impossible not to feel the contradiction. This place built the future, and in doing so, it burned itself out. It lifted millions into a new era of mobility while trapping thousands in exhausting routines. It created wealth, but also inequality, freedom, but also control. This factory was never just about cars. It was about power, about speed, about reshaping society at any cost. And that is why its story still matters. Because the world we live in today, with its mass production, gig work, automation, and surveillance, did not appear out of nowhere. It was forged in places like Highland Park, on concrete floors, under factory lights, one bolt, one shift, one exhausted worker at a time. If you want to understand how America became what it is today, you have to look here, at the factory that changed everything and paid a price for it. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about the places that built our world and the forces that quietly shaped our lives, make sure you stay connected. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and see you next time.